All right, everyone, I think we're ready to get started. My name is Antonia Hylton, and I'm a correspondent for NBC and MSNBC. I'm also the host of our podcast, Southlake and Grapevine, and the author of a book called Madness. It is an honor to be here with all of you. I'm really excited for this conversation. It's still Pride Month, and yeah, it's a party. It's a celebration, I think, but it's also a time for reflection. And I think we all know we're in a really critical moment in which the lives and experiences of LGBTQ Americans, but especially transgender and non-binary Americans, they are hyper-visible. And with that visibility comes a backlash, a debate, and sometimes peril. And so I couldn't be happier to have this group here convened for a conversation, and I don't want to waste a moment. So I'm going to jump in and introduce you to them. First, right next to me, we have Blaise Aguirre Yarcas, a vice president and fellow at Google Research, leading a team working on AI, large language models, smart devices, technology, ethics, and privacy. He is also the author of the books Who Are We Now and Ubisoft, and essays about the relationship between art and technology and on physiognomy and bias in AI. Lucy Sant is a writer and artist. Her many books include 19 Reservoirs, Maybe the People Would Be the Times, and The Other Paris. She began her gender transition in 2021, which she chronicled in her latest book, I Heard Her Call My Name. And last but not least, we have Dan Savage, a writer, advice columnist, and activist. He has been writing Savage Love, his syndicated sex and relationship advice column, since 1991. Is that right? So we have to start here. The Supreme Court just announced that they would hear a case on gender affirmation care for minors in response to a law in Tennessee that has sought to make that form of health care illegal. What's all of your gut reaction? What are you anticipating? And anyone can start.
Nothing good from this Supreme Court as constituted. It is, I agree, it is a shame and a scandal that you have state governments in red states inserting themselves into the private medical decisions that parents and kids in consultation with their doctors are making in the best interests of those children. I live in Seattle. We're already seeing in the blue states gender medicine refugees, people who've left red states where they're being either stigmatized or attacked, as happened in Texas, where they declared any parent who would provide gender medicine to their child is abusive and should be investigated by Department of Children and Family Services. And so it has real consequences. We used to say, like 40 years ago, when I first came out as gay, that all gay people were refugees because we had to flee our families. And even if we only moved to the other side of town, we were refugees. But for the most, we fled from small places to bigger places to be safe. And now you see that is true for the usually straight, opposite-sex, cisgender parents of trans kids because of this sort of legislation. And it's not going to end well at this Supreme Court.
Not for the first time in American history, we have a physical fact that's being judged as if it were a moral decision. You don't choose to be trans, you are trans. And, tell people this, you can't back it up because there's been no research, and there's been no research because there's been no funding. It's just, kids are going to, there's been this moment of opening, this great awakening among the younger generation, which has made it possible for senior citizens like myself to also stop suppressing their gender. People are panicking, they're overestimating numbers, all this stuff, and we're going to be crushed, probably. And if the new administration may try to apply this to the nation as a whole, the fact is that these transgender medicines for the youth are all completely reversible. If they did decide that they made a mistake, they can revert back to their birth gender in a matter of months. So it's a fake panic on top of everything else.
Well, I guess for my part, and I feel the least qualified on this panel to say anything to this for a couple of reasons. One is that, I thank you for the super kind introductions. I also want to make sure that I'm disclaiming that, I'm not speaking as a Google vice president here. The book that I guess is the reason that I'm on this panel, Who Are We Now, is one that I wrote, very much on my own time and with my own resources, and is definitely not like the company line.
We don't want the company line.
So I have no intention.
We won't miss it.
I have no intention to give the company line here. But also, the book was also not a piece of advocacy. I have my own political opinions. I did want to be upfront about those in the book because I think it's hard to even talk about sensitive issues these days without having some kind of positionality statement, and I didn't want to try and hide. At the same time, the point of the book was really to do a kind of forensic analysis of what is going on with identity and including gender and sexuality and so on widely among Americans, and not to make it a piece of advocacy from my own perspective. Personally, I am no more a fan of this Supreme Court or of this moment than anybody else on the stage, I think. Another thing that I'm seeing that I think is causing this current moment is this extreme polarization that is taking place not only in the U.S. but really all over the world, which I have a feeling is due to urbanization. Basically, as people have been concentrating in cities, and cities sort of progress faster culturally, the rate of cultural evolution is much faster as population densities increase. That's led to a kind of pulling apart of the cities and the countryside. And as the cities become denser, it's almost like a tidal force that pulls us further and further apart. And the trouble is that in American politics especially, there's a great overweighting of rural interests, because when we look at bodies like the Senate, they're apportioned by land area more so than by population. Same with congressional districts. So even as we pull apart, and even as more and more people end up in cities, the sort of political imbalance between rural and urban grows as well.
I want to come back to some of what you mentioned there in terms of trends and demographic change here. But Lucy, I want to hear some of your story. Tell me about you wrote all about your transition back in 2021. Mm-hmm. What has it been like for you to tell your story in this specific political moment?
Well, it was a weird feat of timing. Of course, so the term of art among transgender people, my egg cracked. That's not a metaphor I invented. A person who is transgender but hiding it is known as an egg. When they can't stand it any longer, their egg is set to crack. And mine cracked after some 55 years of suppression. I was 66 when I came out. And it happened very quickly. Thank you. After the glacial procession of decades, it happened like a lightning flash. And it had to do, you can read all about it in my book, it had to do with artificial intelligence, actually, with an app called FaceApp, where I was able to see myself as a woman. And it just, the dam broke. And within 2 weeks, I had come out to my immediate circle, like 40 people. And nobody, I didn't lose anybody, by the way. Some people were startled, some people had suspicions confirmed. Either way, everybody was cool. And ever since, I've been public about it, partly because I'm a writer, and I feel that as a writer, it doesn't apply to all writers, but as a writer, I've always felt that I'm not a politician, I'm not an organizer, I'm not a celebrity, but I have a responsibility to be a public witness. And in this case, I'm being a witness to my own transformation. And so, yes, I've been explaining. My book came out in mid-February. Well, since mid-January, I've been interviewed on average about 4 times a week, sometimes more than that. I'm kind of incapable of repeating myself, so it never comes out quite the same way. So I'm not bored. I hope you're not. In any event, I feel at home in my own skin for the first time in my life. I'd always been hiding. I'd always been crawling, just, kind of ashamed of being myself, hated looking at pictures of myself. And now this is me. It's kind of lonely, because for one thing, given my age, I live in a cisgender heterosexual world for the most part. I have gay friends, plenty, but the transgender people I know tend to be under the age of 30, and that's a whole other generation. I have a 24-year-old son myself who, as I enjoy saying, as straight as a highway in Texas, but he understands. The only problem he ever had was trying to figure out how not to call me Dad all the time. So, he can call me Dad. In any event, transitioning has made me brutally honest, incapable of dissimulation because of these layers of deception and contradiction and hiding. I was my own Stasi, I was my own secret police for so long, and having that removed, I've been carrying a piano on my back, a grand piano on my back my entire life, and now I'm not, and it's incredible. And I can only wish for everybody to have a similar experience to the one I had, but it's not given to all.
Whenever anybody says that the gay experience and the trans experience have nothing in common in an attempt to divide trans people and gay people, I always point to that. That you're perceived to be someone that or always knew or eventually come to know you or not, and being able to let go to step into who you actually are, which can be very upsetting and traumatic because you can lose people and the stakes feel very high. That's what trans people and gay people share, the essential core of the coming out.
Right.
Risk. I wanted to jump back for a second to talk about gender affirming care and what we mean when we use affirming care, because it gets demagogued by the right to mean that any kid, that affirmation means that kid is immediately provided with puberty blockers and surgical interventions if wanted. And that's not what affirmation, I think, means when people talk about gender affirming care. Sometimes people, even on the left, will mistake what you mean by gender affirming care for the provision of puberty blockers and surgeries. It means affirming the kid in their exploration of what it is that they are and coming to understand themselves and providing that kid with what they need. That's what the decisions families are making. When you talk about the state inserting itself into the decision the parents, the kid, and their doctors are making, it's not the state inserting itself into a decision that is always puberty blockers. It's the state inserting itself into the choice about whether that's right or not for this particular kid. And in this polarized time, I feel like we end up using different buzzwords, and there's what we mean by gender affirming care, there's what they mean by youth gender medicine, or whatever the right wing's term of art is. And I think it's really important to assert that ideally, and in its best practice, what gender affirming care means is listening to that kid. It doesn't mean a certain prescription or a certain intervention. It means allowing the kid to LGBTQIA+++. The Q stands for questioning. And one of the things a kid can question is your sexual orientation. Another thing is a gender identity. And asking the question doesn't predetermine the answer.
Well, the other misconception, right, is that this all can happen really rapidly. I spend a lot of time in states like Texas, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, and in evangelical churches reporting. And I will have people tell me, I heard that a kid down the street decided to be trans, and then the school nurse gave them puberty blockers, and then the next week, I'm not saying that to make you laugh. This is a real thing that many Americans think, that a kid can go to the local 24-hour clinic and then get all of these services. That's not the reality on the ground. What is it actually like?
Well, for most people, it's extremely difficult. I mean, many people, I happen to have been, I live in the Hudson Valley of New York State, which is a very friendly area to trans people. But if you're out there in a red state, if there's still a Planned Parenthood somewhere in your area, you can go there. Otherwise, you might all have to do it, online or something. It's tough. You are going to be questioned variously. I didn't have to go through this because I was already 66 years old. But if you're a 13, 14-year-old kid, many people assume that you don't know your own mind. And by the way, that's a sub-problem here, is people not respecting the fact that 13-year-olds can know very well who they are, and furthermore, that parents cannot design their own children. There's a big mistake made in other areas than merely gender identification. But in any case, the process is going to be bureaucratic, it's going to take time, it's going to be sinuous, it's going to have to be renewed, and it's going to have a lot of checkpoints and checkups. And of course, surgery is never, ever performed on people under the age of 18. That's important to say, because, the urban legends on that one are profuse.
Blaise, what are you seeing at the data level in research when it comes to that kind of mis and disinformation? When it comes to the questions that people are asking, what Americans are searching for with understanding?
Well, I think there are a couple of factors that are worth pulling apart. One of them has to do with age and changes in definition of what trans means, because it's not the same thing for young people and for people of our age. It used to be the case. I hope it's not offensive. Like I refer to this as like the Priscilla, Queen of the Desert phenomenon. But when we were coming up, trans tended to mean that there had to be surgery involved, and it almost always was transitions to female. And among young people, those the ratios have reversed. So it's actually quite a bit more common now to transition in the other direction. It's also no longer binary. So trans nowadays means not identifying with your sex assigned at birth doesn't necessarily mean identifying with the other sex. So there's a big middle that has opened up as well. So between it being less medicalized and more expansive, the fact that there are actually so many more young trans people doesn't even necessarily mean what a lot of older people assume it means, if that makes sense, because the definitions have shifted too.
I'm curious here in the audience if anyone feels confident enough to shout it out. What's your best guess as to the percentage of Americans who actually identify as trans or non-binary? Do you know?
Nobody's going to be brave enough to say what they think.
Yeah, 2-3%.
Okay, some of you are close, but everyone actually is overestimating. It's, according to numerous studies and polls, actually more like 0.5 to just under 2%. Some polls show that Americans think that up to 20% of their fellow Americans are trans. I'm curious for you, where do you think some of that, when you talk about the polarization, and also just the way in which a minority group can be weaponized politically, how we got to this moment and why that can be reflected in the polling in this way?
Well, first of all, when people are answering that question, I think many of them are making a political statement of one kind or another, as opposed to saying what they actually believe. But for what it's worth, I asked thousands of randomly selected Americans, how what they thought the percentage of trans people was, and the majority of them said well under 1%. Sometimes they wanted to say like 0.001% or something like this. That was a more typical number, and the thing is, like when you actually break the data down, just giving a number, giving a percentage, whether it's 0.5 or 2 or whatever, doesn't tell the story at all because it varies so much by age and by density. So it's much higher in the city, and it's much higher among the young. If you look at people assigned female at birth in the city and under the age of 21, that number is upward of 7%, and maybe as high as 14. On the other hand, when you look at people of our age, it's extremely low, even in the city, let alone in the countryside. In the countryside, it really is, right for people over 50, say, 0.0 something. So, and the thing is, of course, when you give an estimate, you're doing it on the basis of who you know, and also who you think you know, because there are a lot of uncracked eggs out there, especially in the places where it's not accepted, and there's a feedback loop in the lack of acceptance. So, as a result, it can be rational. It can be a real observation when you say, well, it doesn't seem like anybody is trans because you're maybe older, living in the countryside. You don't see anybody who, at least to your knowledge, is trans.
But you do see in the newspaper that 30% of Gen Z identifies as queer,
right?
And for a lot of people, that instantly becomes 30% or 20% of everybody is trans.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
You described the hurdles, that it's not a frictionless process to access trans care. In response to your question about the myth that it's a frictionless process and you can just go and get whatever you want whenever you want it, do you think that process should be frictionless? Are you saying that the hurdles that you had to clear to access care even as an adult were an injustice and they should be wiped away? Because that is what some people argue, that we should make these treatments available without any gatekeeping at all. And people, a 13-year-old knows who they are, and if the 13-year-old wants to block puberty or get top surgery, which has happened, it's not a myth. Like, we don't want to hand the right wing a stick to beat us with by saying this never happens. It's extremely rare, but it has happened, and they can point to these cases where young people who may have benefited from it, and it happened for all the right reasons, and there's no regret, did get surgery as minors. But I'm curious where you come down on that, because I see both arguments being made, that we don't need to worry about anybody being rushed along because the process has so many roadblocks and hurdles. But I also see people saying, and that should be not how it is. It should be a frictionless process where there are no hurdles. And I'm curious where you come down on that.
I'm going to take a middle course, the coward's way out. I don't think it should be automatic. I think some personality assessment has to be done. I think that, yes, and there are probably cases in which affecting this kind of ideation is actually a symptom of something else, So I don't think it should be entirely frictionless, but on the other hand, it should be torturous either. It should be regarded the same way any kind of medical intervention is regarded, really. I mean, it is a medical intervention, and I'll tell you, the process I'm going through in getting hearing aids right now is not frictionless, By the way, going back to the statistics question, I read a fascinating interview, it was in The Guardian about 5 years ago, and it was a trans person on the neurological spectrum, in addition, who noted that that people on the autism spectrum generally self-identified as trans at a rate that was at 2 or 3 times higher than the norm. And this person pointed out it's not because people on the neurological spectrum are more likely to be trans. It's because people on that spectrum are incapable of lying. So, factor in all the people out there, especially people my age, older, and, 4 or 5 decades younger, who have been lying to themselves, as I intended to take this to my grave. There are a lot of others.
On that point, what do you say to the many Americans and elected leaders who argue that some of this is a social contagion? Kids are seeing it on TikTok, on Twitter, on Instagram, and that is turning them trans in some way.
So reducing it to matter of a fad. You know, I mean, I tend to see it as a gradual opening, and all these cultural manifestations since my own teenage years, the Cockettes, and then David Bowie, and then the Rocky Horror Picture Show, on and on and on, one thing after another over the decades. And for me, actually, it was being a professor at a college and seeing the wave kind of reach the shore and then break, which happened about 10, 15 years ago. For the first time I started getting non-binary students. But the social contagion, all I would say is, well, if that's the case, give it 5 years. You know, because fads don't last much longer than that. If people are still wanting to be trans 5 years from now, it's going to mean it's a real thing. I mean, unfortunately, for a lot of people, the matter is so urgent, they don't have 5 years to wait.
What is socially contagious is the permission structure that now exists for people to question the received sex assignment at birth, right? And what is socially contagious, I think, is not more and more people just like deciding they're trans, but more and more people deciding they fall somewhere under this much larger trans umbrella that Blaise talks about, where they're not getting blockers or surgeries or hormones, but they are identifying as non-binary or agender, and that does seem to me to have a social component because of the social permission structure. In the same way that, like, they said when, you know, I'm super gay and super old, and my parents believed that gay was something you caught, that gay was contagious, that we were recruited. Now they have resurrected groomer as the slur. And what was contagious was courage. What was contagious was bravery. And what was contagious was the example of the life authentically lived out, even at great cost. And people who were closeted saw other people living that life and decided that that was better even at whatever cost. And I think that's what is socially contagious. That's what we mean by that. That permission structure is giving some people the courage to identify as trans and to medically transition, but it's giving a whole lot of people the courage to identify as all sorts of things that we also get slapped with the trans label, that then people read when they see those numbers as all of these people are getting puberty blockers, all these people are getting surgeries, when a lot of these people are just getting haircuts and identifying as non-binary.
Spicy. Well, to build a little bit on both of your points, originally social contagion was a term used by social scientists to talk about the way ideas move around social networks, which is a thing. But of course, that word contagion, and Kenji Yoshino, the legal scholar, wrote a great article about this a number of years ago. Also it communicates a sense of this being a disease, which has this sort of semiotic alliance with the idea of being gay being an illness, or now being trans being an illness. And that's really unfortunate because it feeds into all these narratives about grooming or about if you're gay parents and you have a kid, the kid might catch gay from you or something like this. So that's
social
obviously
contagion is real.
But this is the thing, right?
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, exactly. So although that sort of negative connotation is really ugly, some of the response from people on the left when they say, well, there is no such thing as social contagion, I don't subscribe to that idea either. The entire concept of culture and cultural evolution relies on ideas being transmitted through social networks and on that building over time. There is no social or cultural evolution without social contagion. I tried to sort of rebrand it in my book, social transmission, to give it a little bit of a less toxic name. But that's actually really important. That's how progress happens. I also think that being essentialist about it, which is a position that a lot of the left gets pushed into by trying to push back against the social contagion idea and saying that, well, everybody is a certain way, and and there's no you are what you are, and that's it. That's the end of the story. I don't think that that's the case either. We've seen definitions of trans change, that's social. And as those definitions change, as you point out, different people are in or outside of that envelope. Some people are very, very inflexible about some aspect of their identity. It's going to be the way it is, no matter what the circumstances. Many other people are more flexible, are more or less unhappy if they're wedged into, some place where they don't necessarily fit. And some people, come out, later in life, and some people never. Mm-hmm. Some people would have been extraordinarily unhappy the entire time, some less so. There's, I guess I want to push back against the false binary between the binary and the non-binary, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does seem, sorry, I interrupted.
I was just going to say that, it strikes many people who are not, who have never felt, it's a hard thing to conceptualize for people who are cis and do not have, although I do think there's a lot of blurring of boundaries anyway. But the fact is that there are plenty of societies in the world that make allowances for the two-spirit, etc. So we know that trans people have always been around. The thing is, in the West, there has been this extremely strong taboo, such a taboo that it seemed unthinkable, until very recently, and even among parts of the population even now. And why this taboo? And this is just my notion, but I think it's because it makes nonsense of male supremacy. Male supremacy cannot exist if you have traitors, if you have blurred boundaries. It has to be an absolute system. And it's encoded into these kinship patterns. And as social mobility has happened vertically and horizontally, kinship patterns get broken, and that's what permits this kind of taboo breaking to occur.
And does this idea of transmission and contagion, sometimes I'm surprised at the fact that we don't often hear that applied to what we see happening in political theater, which is the overestimation, the use of children especially in these communities as a kind of cudgel. I'm curious if, from your standpoint, but really from all three of you, how you see that. Does that framework apply on the opposite end of the political spectrum?
Well, so to give a kind of data-driven example from not from trans, but from just same-sex attraction and being gay. When I ask people of many ages, are you exclusively same-sex? I actually don't ask, are you exclusively? I ask, how do you identify, and are you sexually attracted to men, sexually attracted to women, romantically attracted to men, romantically attracted to women? If you then plot the fraction of people across all ages who are exclusively same-sex attracted, both sexually and romantically, you find that is actually a very stable 5% or so across all ages. On the other hand, if you ask, are you lesbian or are you gay, you get really different curves. So it's that curve settles down to, well, actually it goes even lower than the 5% among the oldest respondents. But lesbian, for example, at age 18, 19 goes up to 30%. So this is way higher than exclusive same-sex attraction. Well, it used to mean that for a lot of older people, you don't say you're lesbian unless you are exclusively same-sex attracted. And if there was any play, any give, or any degree to which you were a little bit bi or a little bit flexible, you would not apply that label, partly because of the high social cost of doing so. That social cost has obviously gone down a lot, especially in the cities for young people. So much so that that even people who are mainly opposite sex attracted are still identifying sometimes as lesbian. So this is why I say, is this social transmission? Is it not social transmission? Well, obviously there is social transmission in the sense that those labels have come to mean a different thing because of how people talk about it and who they interact with. Does that mean that lesbianism is catching? I think that's a trick question, if that makes sense.
What do you see, Dan? As someone who's seen this and written about this, and you also are part of the media, you and I, I mean...
Well, you talk about these things and write about these things, and then people who read them or encounter them begin to understand that there's more things possible for them, more ways in which they could identify, including, and I've met some myself, opposite-sex attracted, assigned female at birth persons who identify as lesbians. And it's kind of a cultural, tribal signal of allegiance, and almost a wish casting that they would rather have been lesbians. And I find that really fascinating. I'm old. I like words to mean things. And so when I meet people who use a word like that, and increasingly the word you see being used is sapphic, as opposed to lesbian, and their own personal boutique definition, bespoke definition of the word doesn't mean what the word means. I want to get pedantic with them and start arguing with them. But I don't, because whatever. But I do think that we have this problem on the left, where the right will weaponize a concept like social contagion, and the left's pivot is not social transmission, not to try to, which is brilliant, try to strip the word that has a negative connotation out of it and just re-roll it out, but to say that's not a thing, that doesn't happen. Just like we want to say, because they want to weaponize or demagogue around minors getting surgery, but then we'll say that never happens. Well, it does happen. It has happened. And so we have to be careful on the left not to allow the right to basically hurt us into taking these indefensible positions that will be easily demagogued about, including in front of the Supreme Court when this case comes up around youth gender medicine, which I would hope that they would declare these laws unconstitutional and get the state out of the relationship between individuals and their doctors. But we've already seen that the Supreme Court is going to come down on where they'll come down on the side of a dispute like that with Dobbs. And I'm really concerned. Mm-hmm. And I get, as a lefty, I don't like to see lefties set traps for themselves around things like arguing social contagion doesn't exist, when we acknowledge that it exists when it comes to suicide clusters, when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to all sorts of other things, including things that are harmless. Charm bracelets were socially contagious among girls for a while, and nobody had a moral panic about that. And so we don't want to make arguments that can be so easily debunked.
So I have to ask then, how do you talk to people about the reality that while it is a small, small fraction, that there are detransitioners, there are people who regret, who make changes?
I have a friend who was a lesbian for 10 years. And that's fine. And I don't doubt that she was a lesbian when she was lesbian identified. And with women, sexual orientation often for women can be more fluid than for males. For males, it tends to be a little more icy than fluid. But yeah, there are some people who have detransitioned. Some people have said they detransitioned because the social pressure of being trans was too great, or they couldn't pass and it invited violence and they couldn't handle it. But not that anyone should have to handle violence, but there are other people who've detransitioned who are like, I made a mistake. And I think with something as ephemeral and hard to pin down and understand as gender identity, because there isn't a test for it, that is an error that a person could make. Which is why I don't think, when I read Andrea Long-Chu's piece in New York Magazine about why the process should be frictionless and anybody who asks should receive, and I actually think that we should be merging the idea of gender-affirming care and the idea of consistent, persistent, insistent, which used to be the standard for providing transitions to youth, was like that it was persistent and consistent and insistent. And you can allow a kid to sit with their questions and affirm them in the asking of the questions and the seeking of the answers without rushing to the answer of puberty blockers. And the people who argue that they detransition not because of social pressure or fear of violence or stigma or family pressure, but because it wasn't who they actually were, when you listen to what those people say, they say they were affirmed too quickly, that the process for them was too frictionless, and they needed to have more time. They needed some pushback. I have a friend who was non-binary, and he now identifies as he again, called me angrily one day, and we had this conversation, because what he needed when he identified as non-binary was for someone to say, "Are you sure?" Whereas instead everybody said, "Right on, sister," right? Everybody was like, "You go, and I love you and support you." And I said it too. And he's like, I needed pushback at that moment because it actually wasn't right, and it was a source for him, even though there was no medical component, of a lot of pain. And it wasn't true. And it was only, sometimes it's through the process of going through something that you figure out who you are. Just like when you write, you figure out what you think by writing. You sometimes don't know what you think before you start. And I think that can apply to transitioning too. And we have to allow for detransitioning as a trans experience, and not pit detransitioners against transitioning or people who have transitioned. And there may be lessons in what a detransitioner has gone through or knows that would benefit people around making their own mind up with certainty who are pondering transition.
Lucy, do you think that's possible?
Well, I was just going to say, frankly, there are going to be seekers, there are going to be tourists. Just think of religion. Think of people who converted multiple times.
Religion is so socially contagious, if you ever label it that way.
Bingo, yeah. There's, it's been said that all, the line is in my book, but I didn't make it up, that all trans people have the same story, and yet all trans stories, two trans stories are quite alike. Everybody comes to their own conclusion, their own way, and it's rife with contradictions, and probably there'll be changes over time. I'm lucky enough that my own personality was already established before I transitioned, so that I only had to do a little bit of work and the rest was all momentum. But it's invariable that, especially if you accept the fact that male and female are not monolithic duality, after that, it's all gray area.
I would add that, it's frustrating to me to see the left fall back into essentialism in order to, and I can see why it happened. It happened because, a lot of people's experiences, I've always been this way, and I finally, it's not a lifestyle choice, and I finally, my shell cracked. I had a chance to, show the world what I am, and that is obviously an experience many people have had. But it is also true that language is not immutable, it changes over time, and people are not immutable, they change over time. To deny the idea that people can change is to deny the idea of their own agency, which is exactly what we're supposed to be fighting for. To deny the idea that language changes over time is to pretend that culture doesn't evolve. All language changes. So here I have a bit of a disagreement with you, Dan. You say, this is what this word means. Well, that just shows you're old. Every word changes over time, and it's okay for us to fight about it and argue about it, because that's part of that process of change and pushback against change.
That change needs to be earned through argument. Not by diktat.
Sure, and nobody is actually in a position to dictate it, except in France. I guess they have a language board. Yeah.
I want to leave a few minutes for some people here in the audience to ask questions, but before we go to them, I just want to ask all of you what you think the future holds. If you feel optimistic right now, if you are fearful of where the trends are taking us, what's on your mind looking ahead?
Well, we're the current folk devils, and we're extremely vulnerable as a minority. We don't have a legal foundation. We don't have corporate support. We're out there naked in the world, so we can be squashed very easily. And it's happening already in various countries, and it could very well happen here. Especially depending on the results in the next election. So I am scared, yes.
The right-wing myth is we can never risk any progress because society will collapse. The left-wing myth is there's never been progress, right? That we're just as racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, culture, society as we've ever been. we on the left, I think, always should point to the ways in which we made progress and the right's predictions of doom did not come to pass, to prove that whatever they're predicting doom about right now they're wrong about this too. Marriage equality turned 9 or 10 just now, and they predicted people would be marrying kids and people would be marrying animals, and when they undid Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they predicted that 500,000 people would quit active service military, to quit active service military. They were wrong what they said about gay people serving military, about gay people marrying and having kids. They're wrong now about what they're saying about trans people existing in the world too. And trans people are going through it right now, going through the fire. In some ways I see echoes of what trans people are, literally like some of the demagoguery around bathrooms and grooming and recruiting is just what they were saying about gay men 40 years ago, 50 years ago. They're saying about trans people now. They've just taken their hatred off the shelf and re-injected it into the culture. But I see this as a moment of great peril, but also great opportunity for trans people and gender nonconforming people, because all of the attacks on gay people and gay marriage invited the argument about who we were and what we meant. And we won that argument. And I think trans people are going to win this argument. But 2004 was really fucking ugly. The 14 anti-gay marriage amendments in 14 states that cost John Kerry the election, that got George Bush back into office for 4 more insanely incompetent years. That night, my husband and I sat there with our son, and we cried because we thought we were going to have to leave the country, and we couldn't have predicted that 10 years later we would have marriage equality. And so we can't predict right now when it's darkest what 10 years later I think trans people are going to have or where they're going to be. And we shouldn't succumb to pessimism.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, especially on the left, fear has taken hold, and pessimism. And I think that, there are certainly plenty of reasons to be anxious. When I was growing up, when we were growing up, we grew up in the shadow of the Cold War, when nuclear apocalypse was imminent, for real. Right? We narrowly averted it, a few times. I think that zooming out is very, very helpful, and looking at, what the last couple of centuries have looked like. And when you do that, you realize that things are better now than they have ever been, by a large, large factor. In 1900, life expectancy on Earth was 35. And these things are really easy to forget. And I think that one of the reasons for that, Hans Rosling pointed this out in his last book that he kind of wrote on his deathbed. Good news tends to happen incrementally. Progress is incremental. And we are wired to notice changes. So, no news story has ever been written saying, 1.6% fewer cases of river blindness in India last year, right? Whereas, school bus, full of kids kidnapped by Boko Haram, that's news, right? So it's snakes and ladders. The uphill is slow, the downhill is fast, but it does tend upward over time, despite the setbacks. So I'm fundamentally an optimist.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. We have just a couple moments. Now is the time to raise your hand if you have a question, and I know there are some people coming around with microphones. Right here in the front.
There's been research about the overlap between autism and Asperger's. There's been a lot of literature on the overlap between neurodiversity, mainly autism, Asperger's, and transgender, and vice versa. Just more than the averages and everything. And I was wondering what your opinions are in the sense that if this is true, shouldn't the transgender specialists and psychologists and autism specialists be trained in the other as well?
I think it's a false syllogism. I quoted, just earlier on this dais, I quoted this story in The Guardian about 5 years ago, and it was an interview between cisgender heterosexual father and his transgender son, who was on the autism spectrum, and the son said, yeah, the rates are for transness among people on the autism spectrum are at least twice as high, if not 3 times, as the general population. Is that because people on the spectrum are more likely to be trans? No, it's because they can't lie to themselves.
Okay, as one just happens what I do. I'm not a professional, but at differentbrains.org, where we advocate for neurodiversity, many of our interns and the people we speak to are neurodiverse on the autism spectrum, Asperger's, and I apologize. I was just saying, and what I do at differentbrains.org, we're not-for-profit that advocates for neurodiversity. And we have found amongst our interns and amongst the literature that there is an increased incidence in both ways. In other words, if you interview 100 transgender individuals, more of them will be on the spectrum, not meaning deeply autistic, but Asperger's and high-functioning autism, than regular population, and vice versa. So the only point I was making and why I wanted to bring it up was I think it would behoove everybody to get some training in both, to train the autism professionals and psychologists and so forth in transgender, and the transgender specialists, if you will, in autism. That was the only point I was making.
Thank you. We have only a little bit time left, and I want to make sure we have at least one other person, if that's okay. Give him 1 second.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Brianna Barrett. I'm a playwright. I mostly write plays about gender identity in ways that are comedic and kind of sneak people into compassion that they weren't expecting to walk away with when they see a play, hopefully. And I guess I feel like the modern conversation around gender and transgender identity and non-binary identity ends up in this place where we're talking about how to justify ourselves to other people, and I'm left wanting to hear more, I guess, about how we create a community where people don't feel like they need to justify themselves so much. This idea of this sort of bio-essentialism, I was born this way, it has to be this persistent identity, like, I remember during, the George Bush election how this demagoguery around this idea of is it a choice or are you born with it? And for some reason we got so caught up in this idea that you had to prove it was real and that something can't be a choice that is also real. Like, I don't understand why there's not more discussion around, like, yeah, maybe it's a choice, who cares? Maybe you're doing it to get along with your friends, and who cares? There's a million identities that children and adults alike take on to find community and to find people that understand them. And so what? Maybe it's a choice, maybe we change our minds later, maybe it's a mistake, nobody's questioning everyone else who gets plastic surgery or any kind of other medical intervention that they didn't work out the way they hoped and changed their mind about later. Nobody questions a woman who, gives birth and then says, I kind of wish I didn't. There's a lot of unchangeable choices we make based on notions we have at one point in our lives or another. And why not just stand behind the banner of choice is cool? If it's a choice, fine, and we have the right to make it.
We can stand behind the banner that choice is cool and everyone has the right to make their own choice, and also acknowledge that for most people, particularly around their sexual orientation, they don't experience it as a choice. Particularly gay men in my generation, you chose straight desperately and proved to yourself that it wasn't a choice. You didn't choose gay. As for the point you began with, we shouldn't have to justify ourselves, you're absolutely right, we shouldn't have to, but we're going to have to. Because when you're a tiny minority and you're invisible and spread randomly through the population, it's going to be hardwired into the experience of being a part of that minority that you're going to be in negotiation with the majority, whether you like it or not, and always. And so, yeah, we shouldn't have to justify ourselves. Welcome to being, 4% of the population, 5% of the population, and existing in a culture where the person that you are has been stigmatized and marginalized for thousands of years. We're going to have to justify ourselves. We're really good at it. That's why we're winning the argument, at least now. We've made progress. And I don't think we should stop. And yeah, as to whether it's a choice or not, Mormonism is a choice. Everybody who says, It's a choice of the same people who are out there proselytizing around the religion. And it doesn't matter if it's a choice. But it also is true of most people's lived experience of their sexual orientation that it was unchosen.
I also think that your question gets at two really deep philosophical issues about what is reality and what is free will that are really not simple. You
talk about zooming out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just atoms out there. So is this a chair or not? Is not a statement about like a physical reality. It's about a perception and a history. It was manufactured as a chair. If we make neural nets that generate pictures of chairs, you can, sort of transition smoothly from something that looks like a chair to something that doesn't, and everybody will have a different idea about exactly where that shift took place. What's reality? So I don't think these questions have Boolean answers, and I think that anybody who wants to claim that this is physical or biological reality is actually not understanding the nature of reality.
And not all choices are exactly the same. You can choose to identify as gay or lesbian or bi, and you can realize later that that's not who you are anymore, or it's not whatever. Like, different choices have different stakes or potential consequences, as we've seen with detransitioners. If like the consequence or stakes was an orchiectomy, you can't walk that back very easily. And so that's a choice you're going to want to, I think, have some friction in that process, so that if you do make that choice and it's the right choice for you, that it is the right choice for you. And that requires more thought than just, I'm non-binary now. Like, we have to be able on the left to recognize stakes and consequences being different for different groups.
Thank you, Dan, Lucy, Blaze. It's really been such a joy and an honor to get to know the three of you and to spend some time with you today. And thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.